Berlin, April 1945. The sky is no longer blue, it is a choking grey curtain of smoke and ash. The ground shakes, not from an earthquake, but from the relentless pounding of Soviet artillery, inching closer, block by crumbling block. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a concrete tomb buried 50 feet underground, the Third Reich is breathing its last gasps. Adolf Hitler is dead, a bullet to the temple, a cyanide capsule for his new bride. The dictator has checked out of history, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a circle of followers who have suddenly lost their God. For 12 years, these men tied their souls to his rising star. Now that star has collapsed into a black hole, and it is threatening to pull them all in with it. But what happens when a fanatic loses the object of his obsession? Does he wake up? Does he run? Or does he double down and commit an act so unspeakable that it ensures he can never be forgotten? Joseph Goebbels didn't want to escape. Escape was for cowards. Escape implied that there was a life worth living outside the shadow of the swastika. For the Minister of Propaganda, the man who had engineered the Führer myth from scratch, survival was not the goal. Immortality was. On May 1st, just 24 hours after Hitler's suicide, Goebbels and his wife Magda gathered their 6 children. They were beautiful children, the darlings of Nazi newsreels, innocent symbols of a future that was never going to happen. They were sedated, perhaps told they were getting medicine to help them sleep through the bombing. And then, while they lay unconscious, their mother crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth. Think about that for a second. This wasn't an act of panic. This wasn't a mother protecting her children from a barbarian horde. It was an ideological sacrifice. Goebbels wrote that a world without National Socialism was not a world fit for his children. He didn't kill them to save them. He killed them because they were props in his final stage play. After the children were gone, Goebbels and Magda walked up the stairs, out of the bunker and into the garden of the Chancellery. He arranged for an SS orderly to shoot them, or perhaps he did it himself. The details are lost in the smoke. But the message was clear. He wanted his death to be as enduring as granite. He wanted to prove that his loyalty was absolute, transcending even the biological instinct to protect his own offspring. But here is the question that lingers in the dark. Was this loyalty? Or was it the ultimate act of vanity? Goebbels knew the war was lost years before the first Soviet tank crossed the border. Yet he kept the cameras rolling, he kept the speeches coming. In the end, did he die for Hitler, or did he die because he was terrified of facing a mirror without the mask of the propaganda minister staring back? While Goebbels chose a fiery exit, others in the inner circle were making very different plans. They weren't looking for a grave, they were looking for a job. While the bunker became a tomb, the roads out of Berlin were clogged with the wreckage of a dying empire. And amidst the fleeing soldiers and desperate refugees, the man who had once been the most feared figure in Europe was trying to pull off a staggering act of reinvention. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the architect of the Holocaust, suffered from a delusion so profound it bordered on insanity. As the Third Reich collapsed, Himmler didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a statesman, a partner. He genuinely believed that the British and Americans would need him. Why? Because he controlled the SS. He thought he could offer the West a deal. Let me keep my army, and I will help you fight the Soviets. He even picked out a new title for himself, Minister of Police, in a post-war government. Imagine the staggering arrogance. He was traveling north, carrying false papers, but in his mind, he was drafting treaties. When he sent secret cables to the Western Allies offering a separate peace, he didn't expect arrest. He expected a handshake. The response from London and Washington was silence. The response from Berlin was rage. When Hitler heard of Himmler's betrayal, he stripped him of all rank. Himmler was suddenly a man with no country. The West wanted to hang him. The Nazis wanted to shoot him. When he was finally captured by the British, disguised as a common soldier named Heinrich Hitzinger, wearing an eye patch, he couldn't help himself. He ripped off the disguise and announced his true identity. He expected respect. What he got was a strip search. Realizing the game was up, that there would be no negotiation, only a noose, Himmler bit into a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. He convulsed on the floor and died in minutes. He cheated the hangman, yes, but he also proved that the loyalty of the SS was a lie. The moment the power structure cracked, the master of terror tried to sell out his master to save his own skin. Then there was Hermann Göring. If Himmler's delusion was bureaucratic, Göring's was theatrical. The Reichsmarschall, once a decorated fighter pilot, and the second most powerful man in Germany, had spent the war descending into addiction and excess. But as the end approached, he believed he was the natural successor to Hitler. From his retreat in Bavaria, he sent a telegram to the bunker asking to take control of the Reich. Hitler, in his final rage, branded him a traitor. Göring didn't care. He surrendered to the Americans with trunks full of champagne, caviar, and stolen art. He posed for photos with US soldiers, chatting and laughing as if the war had been a sporting match that his team simply lost. He thought he could sit down with General Eisenhower, man to man, and sort this whole war crimes misunderstanding out. It wasn't until he was stripped of his medals and thrown into a cold cell at Nuremberg that reality set in. But even then, Göring didn't break. He detoxed from the drugs and regained his sharp, predatory intellect. In the courtroom, he ran circles around the prosecutors. He was charming, funny, and utterly unrepentant. He knew he was going to die, but he wanted to control the ending. He petitioned the court for a firing squad, a soldier's death. The court said no, you will hang like a common criminal. So just hours before his execution, Göring swallowed cyanide he had smuggled into his cell. Why does this matter? Because it was his final act of spite. He denied the Allies the image of his body swinging from a rope. Even in death, he forced the world to look at him on his terms. In the chaos of 1945, Berlin was a city of ghosts. Buildings were skeletons, streets were craters, and identities were fluid. If you were quick enough, if you were lucky enough, you could slip into the smoke and never come back. Martin Bormann was the shadow behind the throne. He wasn't famous like Goebbels or flashy like Göring. He was the gatekeeper, the bureaucrat, the man who controlled who saw Hitler and who didn't. And on May 1st, he made a break for it. He left the bunker with a small group, dodging Soviet patrols moving through the burning subway tunnels. And then, silence. For decades, Martin Bormann was the world's most wanted ghost. Was he in Argentina? Was he living in a villa in Paraguay? Sightings poured in from all over the globe. He became a boogeyman, a symbol of the idea that the Nazis hadn't really been defeated, just relocated. In reality, he didn't make it past the train station. In 1972, construction workers in Berlin found 2 skeletons in the dirt. DNA testing later confirmed Bormann had died that night in 1945, likely taking cyanide when he realized he was surrounded. There is something poetic about that. The man who controlled the Nazi Party, who wielded immense power from the shadows, ended up as nothing more than anonymous bones in the mud, walked over by thousands of people who had no idea he was there. He didn't get a grand escape, he got an unmarked hole in the ground. But if Bormann was the ghost who vanished physically, Rudolf Hess was the ghost who vanished mentally. Hess is the enigma of the war. In 1941, he flew a plane to Scotland, parachuted into a field, and demanded to see the Duke of Hamilton. He thought he could single-handedly stop the war between Germany and Britain. Was he mad? Was he a visionary? Or was he just a sycophant trying to impress Hitler with a grand gesture? The British locked him up and threw away the key. Hitler declared him insane. By 1945, Hess was a broken shell. At Nuremberg, he stared blankly at the ceiling. He claimed amnesia. He talked to himself. While the other Nazis were executed, Hess was sent to Spandau prison, and there he stayed for 40 years. Think about the cruelty of that existence. He was the only prisoner in a massive fortress designed for hundreds. The world changed outside. Men walked on the moon. The Berlin Wall went up, and Hess just walked circles in the yard, an old man guarding the ashes of a dead empire. When he finally died in 1987, strangled by an electrical cord in a garden shed, it closed the book on the inner circle. But it left a question. Was keeping a senile old man in a cage for 4 decades justice? Or was it revenge? History is written by the victors, but sometimes the losers manage to grab the pen. Meet Albert Speer, the good Nazi. That's what the newspapers called him. That's what he called himself. Speer was Hitler's architect and later his minister of armaments. He kept the war machine running. He used slave labor. Thousands died to build his weapons. But at Nuremberg, Speer did something brilliant. He didn't scream like Göring. He didn't whine like Himmler. He apologized. He wore a suit, not a uniform. He spoke calmly. He admitted a collective responsibility for the regime's crimes, but, and this is the key, he claimed he didn't know about the Holocaust. He painted himself as a technocrat, a man blinded by ambition, a specialized worker who just wanted to build beautiful buildings and didn't look in the basement. It was a lie, a masterpiece of a lie. We know now that Speer was at meetings where the final solution was discussed. He visited camps, he knew, but the judges at Nuremberg, they wanted to believe him. They needed a sane Nazi to explain how a civilized country went mad. Speer gave them that narrative. He escaped the hangman. He served 20 years, and when he came out, he became a celebrity. He wrote best-selling books, he gave interviews. He died a free man, rich and respected. He successfully laundered his reputation while millions of his victims lay in mass graves. And then there was Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was a different kind of liar. He didn't use charm, he used duty. When Hitler blew his brains out, he left the keys to the Reich to Dönitz, a Grand Admiral of the Navy. For 20 days, Dönitz was the president of Germany. Can you imagine? The war is over, the cities are dust, and this man is sitting in a naval base in Flensburg pretending he's running a government. He even held cabinet meetings. At Nuremberg, he argued he was just a sailor. He said, "I fought a clean war, I didn't kill civilians," except he ordered unrestricted submarine warfare. He knew his U-boats were sinking merchant ships and leaving sailors to drown in the freezing Atlantic. But here's the twist. Dönitz's defense worked, partially. His lawyer produced a document from an American admiral admitting the US Navy did the exact same thing in the Pacific. The court couldn't hang him for a crime the Allies were also guilty of. So Dönitz got 10 years. He walked out in 1956 and lived a quiet life in the suburbs. He never apologized. He never repented. Until the day he died, he received fan mail from former sailors. He was the last Führer, and he died in his bed. Why does this make us so uncomfortable? Because we want monsters to look like monsters. We want them to be foaming at the mouth like Goebbels. But Speer and Dönitz remind us of a terrifying truth. You can help destroy the world and still be polite, articulate, and well-dressed. While Speer and Dönitz were busy polishing their reputations, 3 men sat in the dock at Nuremberg who had no place to hide. Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. These were not men of imagination. They were the gears in the machine. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl represented the German military elite. They were the men with the maps, the strategies, and the crisp grey uniforms. Throughout the war, they stood next to Hitler, pointing at front lines and nodding as he ordered armies into oblivion. Keitel, known behind his back as Lake Itel, a pun on the German word for lackey, had signed some of the most criminal orders of the war. The Commissar Order, which authorized the summary execution of Soviet political officers. The Night and Fog Decree, which allowed civilians to be disappeared into the prison system without a trace. At Nuremberg, Keitel stood tall and argued that a soldier's only duty is obedience. He claimed that refusing an order was treason. It is a seductive argument. In the military, insubordination is a crime. But the tribunal asked a simple, devastating question. Is there a point where a moral duty outweighs a military one? If you are ordered to shoot a child, does the uniform absolve you of the murder? Keitel couldn't answer that. He wanted to be shot by a firing squad, a death befitting a marshal. The court refused. They hanged him like a criminal to prove that a uniform is not a shield for conscience. Alfred Jodl was arguably the smarter of the two, a brilliant strategist. But he too signed the papers. He too passed the orders down the chain. He claimed he was trying to save Germany from chaos, that someone had to steer the ship. But the ship was steering toward genocide, and Jodl kept his hands firmly on the wheel. He was hanged alongside his superior, outraged to the end that the victors dared to judge the vanquished. And then there was Ernst Kaltenbrunner. If Keitel and Jodl were the cold face of the military, Kaltenbrunner was the brutal face of the SS. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with deep dueling scars across his face, Kaltenbrunner looked like a villain from a cheap thriller. He had taken over the Reich Main Security Office after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. This made him the boss of the Gestapo and the overseer of the final stages of the Holocaust. Unlike the generals, Kaltenbrunner didn't argue about duty. He simply lied. He claimed he was a figurehead. He claimed he didn't know about the gas chambers. It was a pathetic display. Witnesses described how he inspected Mauthausen concentration camp, joking with the guards while prisoners starved a few yards away. The evidence against him was a mountain of paper. When the verdict of death was read, he looked stunned. He had spent his life sending people to the grave with a stroke of a pen, yet he seemed unable to comprehend that the pen had finally turned on him. If the generals were the hands of the regime, Joachim von Ribbentrop was its voice, and Hans Frank was its butcher. Their stories at Nuremberg reveal the two extremes of how the Nazi elite faced their end, one with delusion and one with theatrical regret. Ribbentrop was the foreign minister, the man who had once been the toast of London society. He was a former wine salesman who had climbed the Nazi ladder by telling Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear. He was the architect of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the deal with Stalin that paved the way for World War II. By 1945, Ribbentrop was a broken man. He was found hiding in a Hamburg apartment, clutching a letter he had written to Winston Churchill, pleading for understanding. At the trial, he was a disaster. He rambled, he whined, he tried to claim that he was actually a peacemaker who had been misunderstood by the entire world. The other defendants in the dock despised him. Even Goering, who had no love for anyone but himself, reportedly said that Ribbentrop was an embarrassment. He was the first to hang on the night of October 16, 1946. His final words were a jumbled wish for peace. It was a hollow sentiment from the man who had set the world on fire. Hans Frank, however, took a different path. Frank was the Governor-General of occupied Poland. Under his rule, the ghettos of Warsaw and Krakow were established. He oversaw the enslavement of a nation. He once bragged to a reporter, "If I were to put up a poster for every 7 Poles shot, the forests of Poland would not be sufficient to manufacture the paper." He was a lawyer by trade. But at Nuremberg, faced with his own 38-volume diary, which detailed his crimes in excruciating detail, Frank collapsed. He converted to Catholicism in his cell. He grew a beard. He wept in the courtroom. he told the judges. 1,000 years will pass and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased. He admitted everything. It was a shocking turn. Was it real? Or was it the final desperate act of a lawyer trying to plea bargain with God because he knew he couldn't plea bargain with the tribunal? The judges weren't swayed by his tears. Repentance does not bring back the dead. Frank was sentenced to hang. The sun rose over Nuremberg on October 17, 1946, but the men who had cast such a long shadow over the 20th century were gone. Their bodies were photographed, then burned in the crematorium at Dachau, a final grim irony, and their ashes were scattered into a tributary of the Isar River. No graves, no shrines, just dust washing away into the water. The story of Hitler's inner circle is a story of disintegration. When the magnetic force of the Führer was removed, the metal filings scattered. Some, like Goebbels, chose to burn out in a blaze of fanaticism. Others, like Himmler and Göring, retreated into delusion, believing their own lies until the very end. Some, like Bormann, vanished into the earth. And some, like Speer, reinvented themselves. But why do we still tell these stories? Why are we still fascinated by the final days of these men? It isn't just because of the scale of their crimes, it is because their reactions to the collapse hold a mirror up to human nature. We like to think of Nazis as inhuman monsters, distinct from us, a different species entirely. But looking at them in 1945, we see something far more disturbing. We see fear, we see vanity, we see the desperate, clawing need to survive. We see men who were fathers, husbands, and colleagues, who had convinced themselves that murder was duty and genocide was patriotism. The unraveling of the inner circle proves that evil is not a supernatural force. It is a choice made by people who are terrified of losing power. From the bunker in Berlin to the gallows in Nuremberg, they showed us that when a regime built on lies finally crumbles, the truth doesn't set you free. It hunts you down. The Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. In the end, it lasted 12. But the scars it left and the lessons of how easily civilized men can descend into barbarism will last forever.